The wagon seat was hard, the kind of hard that worked its way into the bones after enough miles, and Marin Ashby had long since stopped noticing it. She sat with her spine straight and her hands folded over the leather satchel in her lap, watching the landscape change through the small gap in the canvas flap she had held open with 2 fingers since the last rest stop. The land out here was nothing like what she had known. It was wide in a way that felt almost aggressive, as if the earth itself was daring a person to cross it, and the sky above was the pale, washed-out blue of something that had been left too long in the sun. Dry grass ran in every direction, interrupted here and there by stands of pine that rose dark and close against the ridgeline. There were no soft edges to any of it. Everything was either too far away or coming at her too fast, and the cold that crept through the canvas was the kind that carried weight. She had been traveling for 11 days. The satchel on her lap held 3 things: a change of clothes wrapped in brown paper, a small ledger book, its spine cracked from use, filled with numbers in her own careful hand, and a folded document, sealed once with wax that had since crumbled at the edges, which she had read so many times in the past 2 weeks that she no longer needed to open it to know what it said. It was a contract, a marriage contract, drawn up by her father in the last months of his life, and signed by a man named Callum Price, who owned a ranch somewhere at the end of this road, and who had agreed, in plain and business-like language, to receive one Marin Ashby as a bride in exchange for the forgiveness of a debt her father had carried for years. She had not been consulted. She had found the document in her father's desk 3 days after his funeral, tucked beneath an unpaid invoice and a half-empty bottle of ink, and she had sat with it in her hands for a long time before she understood what it meant. It meant she had already been decided. She did not cry when she understood. She had done her crying earlier, in the weeks when her father's health had declined and she had managed his books and paid his creditors with money she earned taking in correspondence work for merchants who needed letters written in a clean hand. She had cried then, quietly and privately, and when he was gone, she found she had very little left. What remained was something colder and more useful. She had looked at the contract, and then at the stack of outstanding debts on his desk, and she had done the arithmetic the way she always did, carefully and without sentiment. The numbers told a clear story. There was no other way out that did not end in disgrace. So she had packed the satchel, arranged for the boarding house where she had been living to hold her remaining trunk until she could send for it, and she had bought a seat on the westbound wagon. She was not afraid. She told herself this regularly, the way a person tells themselves something they need to believe. She was practical. She was capable. She had kept her father's accounts for 3 years without making a single error he ever caught. And she could cook, and she could sew, and she could read a legal document well enough to find the part that mattered. She was not going to a stranger empty-handed. She was going with skills, which was more than most women could say. What she was, if she was honest, was tired. The wagon lurched over a rut, and she caught the canvas flap before it could close, and through the gap she saw the road beginning to narrow, the pines crowding closer on either side, and in the distance, just becoming visible through the late afternoon light, a structure. A fence line first, its posts weathered to silver, running along the edge of a field where the grass had been grazed short. Then a barn, its roof patched in at least 3 places, with wood that was lighter than the rest, which meant the patches were newer than the building. Then a house, low and wide, with a covered porch that ran the length of the front, and smoke, coming from a pipe in the roof, and a man standing at the gate. He was not watching for the wagon. That was the first thing she noticed. He was turned slightly away from the road, crouched beside one of the fence posts with a hammer in his hand, working at something near the base of it. He wore a coat the color of old bark and a hat with a brim that had been shaped by years of weather rather than any intention. He was broad in the shoulders and his movements were deliberate, the kind of deliberate that came from doing a thing the same way for a long time. When the wagon came close enough that the driver called out, the man stood and he turned and he looked at the wagon with an expression that was not quite welcome and not quite wariness, but something in between that Maren could not yet name. He was older than she had imagined. Not old, but worn in the particular way that this land seemed to wear on people, as if every year out here counted for two somewhere else. There were lines at the corners of his eyes, and his jaw was set with the kind of permanence that suggested it was rarely anything other than set. He was not unkind looking. He was simply closed, the way a door was closed, not locked necessarily, but not inviting either. The wagon stopped. The driver climbed down and said something to the man that Maren could not hear. She gathered her satchel, smoothed her skirt, and stepped out of the wagon on her own, declining with a small shake of her head the driver's half-hearted offer of a hand. She stood in the road and the cold hit her at once, sharper than it had been through the canvas, carrying the smell of pine and dry earth and something faint beneath it that might have been wood smoke. The man walked to the gate and opened it, and they stood on either side of it and looked at each other. Up close, his eyes were a steady gray, the kind that did not give much away. He looked at her the way she suspected he looked at most things, with an assessment that was thorough and unhurried and revealed nothing of its conclusions. She spoke first because someone had to. "Mr. Price, Miss Ashby." His voice was low and even, not warm, not cold. Simply factual, the way a man states something he has already decided to accept. He held out his hand and she shook it, and it was brief and firm and entirely without ceremony, which suited her better than ceremony would have. He reached for her satchel and she handed it over without arguing, not because she needed help carrying it, but because refusing would have been its own kind of performance, and she was too tired for performances. "Wagons going on?" he asked, looking past her to the driver already climbing back up. "Yes, I didn't bring much." He nodded as though this was the expected answer, which perhaps it was, and he turned and walked toward the house, and she followed him through the gate and heard it close behind her with a sound that was quiet and final and ordinary, the way most important moments sounded like nothing at all. Inside, the cabin was a single large room with a smaller door at the back that stood half open onto a narrow corridor. The walls were rough timber, the floor packed earth, and the whole of it smelled of wood smoke and something cooked earlier in the day, and the faint mineral smell of cold coming in through gaps she could not yet locate. There was a stove in the center, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of supplies, and a window on the east wall that let in what remained of the afternoon light. It was not a comfortable room. It was a functional one, organized with the particular efficiency of a person who had lived alone long enough to stop compensating for it. He set her satchel on the table and turned to face her, and his hands went into his coat pockets, and he looked at her with that same steady assessment. "I'll tell you how it is," he said. "I need someone who can manage the books. The accounts have gotten complicated, and I don't have a head for numbers the way they need to be handled. The work is real. The winters out here are hard, and there's no room for someone who isn't willing to work." She met his eyes. I understand. The room at the back is yours. He nodded toward the corridor. There's a lock on the door. I had it put in before you came. She did not look away from his face. Thank you. It isn't charity, he said, and the word came out without apology. We've both come into this with reasons. I won't ask about yours if you don't ask about mine. That suits me. He nodded once, the way a man nods when something is settled, and he went to the stove and began building up the fire, and Marin picked up her satchel and walked to the back corridor and found the room he had described. It was small, barely enough space for the narrow bed and the chest against the wall, but the window faced north, and through it she could see the edge of the pines against the darkening sky. And there was a lock on the door, a new one, the brass still bright where it hadn't had time to tarnish. She sat on the edge of the bed and set the satchel on the floor and let herself be still for the first time in 11 days. She was not afraid. She was not hopeful either. She was simply here, in this room, at the end of a road she had not chosen. And the thing to do now was what she had always done. She would open the books, and she would find the numbers, and she would make them mean something. That was enough to begin with. She heard him moving in the main room, the sound of a pot set on the stove, the drag of a chair. She did not go out. She sat with her hands in her lap in the small room with the new lock until the light through the window went from blue to gray to nothing. And then she opened the satchel and took out the ledger book and held it in her hands in the dark for a moment before she realized she needed a lamp. She went out to find one, and he was sitting at the table with a tin cup in front of him, not eating, not reading, simply sitting, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway. She asked about a lamp without explaining why she needed it, and he pointed to the shelf, and she took the one he indicated and lit it from the stove and went back to her room and closed the door and turned the new lock until she felt it catch. That was the first night. She did not sleep much. This was not fear, or not only fear. It was the strangeness of the room, the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, the creak of the walls as the temperature dropped, the distant sound of horses in the barn. She lay on top of the blanket with her coat still on and listened and organized what she knew. She knew the terms of the contract. She knew his name. She knew the lock worked. She knew there was a stove in the main room and wood stacked beside it, and that he was competent in the way that people who lived alone in hard places had to be competent. These were things she could use. In the early hours, when the cold had settled fully into the room and she had pulled the blanket over herself without quite deciding to, she heard the sound of a rider, not coming fast and not stopping, just passing at a distance, the sound of hooves on hard ground moving slowly along the tree line north of the ranch. She lay still and listened until the sound faded, and then she turned onto her side and watched the faint line of lighter dark at the bottom of the window where the snow on the ground outside threw back a little of the night sky. She filed the sound of the rider away in the same part of her mind where she kept unreconciled line items in an account. A thing noted. A thing to return to. In the morning, she rose before it was fully light and found her way to the wash basin in the corridor, and then to the main room where the fire had been banked and the coffee was already made, which meant he had been up before her. He was not inside. She poured a cup and stood at the east window and watched the light come up over the ridgeline and felt the coffee warm her hands through the tin. When she was finished, she opened the satchel and took out her own ledger and set it on the table and looked around the room until she found what she was looking for. It was on the shelf above the supply crates, A thick book with a dark cover, its spine worn to threads on one side. She took it down and opened it and stood at the table and began to read. By the time he came back inside, stamping frost from his boots at the door, she had been through 12 pages and she had already found the first problem. He looked at her over the open book and the notes she had begun making in her own ledger, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he went to the stove and poured himself coffee, and came to stand at the opposite side of the table and looked at what she was reading. "How bad?" he said. It was not quite a question. "The accounts are in reasonable order," she said carefully, "but the totals don't match what I'd expect from the volume of stock you're running. Either the numbers have been entered incorrectly over time, or the outgoings are higher than you realize." He was quiet. He looked at the book rather than at her. "I'll need a few days to go through all of it," she said. "But you should know there's a discrepancy, a significant one." He set the cup down and pulled out the chair across from her and sat, and she watched him look at the numbers she had circled in her own ledger without touching them, without asking to be shown, just looking. And in his face, she saw something she recognized because she had seen it in her father's face in those last months. The look of a man who has been keeping a door shut against something and has just heard a knock he can no longer ignore. She did not say anything else. She let him look. He was still looking when the sound of hooves reached them from outside. Not a rider this time, but a horse and a light vehicle, moving at the practiced pace of someone who traveled this road often enough to know every stone in it. Callum stood and went to the window, and his expression did not change exactly, but something in his posture shifted, a tightening she would not have noticed if she hadn't already been watching him. "Stay inside," he said, not unkindly, and he took his coat from the hook and went out. She moved to the window. The man who drove up in the small black wagon was somewhere in his 50s, well dressed for the territory, which was to say his coat was better cut than it needed to be, and his horse was better kept than the road required. He had a wide, pleasant face, and he climbed down with the ease of a man who considered himself welcome wherever he arrived. He spoke to Callum with his hat in his hand and a smile that was doing a great deal of work, and Callum stood with his arms at his sides and listened and said very little. The pleasant man looked toward the cabin, not a glance, but a look, the kind that wanted to see something specific. His gaze moved to the window and Maren stepped back, not from fear, but from instinct. And when she stepped back, she was at the right angle to see the table, and on the table was the open ranch ledger and her own ledger beside it with the circled numbers. And she looked at both of them and then looked back at the window where the pleasant man had just been looking. He had smiled at her through the glass. She was sure of it. Callum came back inside after several minutes and hung his coat and poured the last of the coffee and did not speak immediately. She waited. "That's Silas Drum," he said finally. "He owns the land on the eastern side of the valley. He's been trying to buy this ranch for 2 years. She looked at him steadily. "What did he want today?" "Said he wanted to welcome you." Callum set the cup down. "Friendly call." Maren thought about the way Drum's eyes had moved to the window, the way they had moved to the window, and then, just for a fraction of a moment, down to where the ledger would have been visible on the table if he had a good enough angle and the light was right. "Did he come inside?" "No." "Good," she said, and she turned back to the table and closed the ranch ledger and moved her own notes on top of it and did not explain why. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not yet read, and then he sat down across from her again, and there was a quality to his silence that was different from before. Less like a door and more like a man deciding whether to open one. That evening, after the meal was finished and the dishes were done and he had gone to check the horses in the barn, Maren took the lamp to her room and sat on the bed and opened the bottom drawer of the chest against the wall. It was empty, which she had expected. She put her ledger in it and closed the drawer and sat for a moment in the lamplight. Then she reached under the edge of the mattress where she had folded it that morning and pulled out the document she had found on his desk. Not the marriage contract. This was something else. Something she had found in the ranch ledger tucked between 2 pages near the middle, placed there deliberately rather than misfiled, a single folded sheet. A notice from a lending office 3 valleys over. A final notice, she saw when she read it again, for a debt that had been accumulating in silence for longer than the numbers on the surface of the books suggested. A final notice with a deadline that was 6 weeks away. She sat with it in her hands for a long time. Outside, she heard the barn door, and then his boots on the porch, and then the sound of the cabin door closing. The stove settled. The wind pressed against the north window. She thought about the man in the black wagon with his pleasant face and his eyes that had moved to the table. She thought about the numbers that didn't match, and the door that had a new lock on it, and the way Callum Price had looked at the circled figures in her ledger, and she understood that she had arrived in the middle of something that had been building for a long time before she was ever part of it. She had come here to pay a debt. It appeared the books were more complicated than anyone had told her. She folded the notice carefully and put it in the drawer with her ledger and turned the key and lay down on the bed with her coat still on and stared at the ceiling in the dark. She was not afraid, but she was very much awake. The first week passed the way first weeks in unfamiliar places always passed, slowly at the edges and too fast at the center, full of small adjustments that accumulated into something that began to resemble a routine without either of them deciding to make one. Maren rose before light every morning. This was not a choice, so much as a habit formed over years of managing a household that ran on borrowed time, where the quiet hours before the rest of the world woke were the only hours that truly belonged to her. She made coffee on the stove using the method she found worked best with his equipment, a slower pour than she was accustomed to, but one that produced something stronger and less bitter. And she stood at the east window with the cup in her hands and watched the light come up over the ridgeline while she organized the day in her mind. Callum was always already awake. She did not know when he slept or whether he slept much at all. He was simply present in the mornings the way the stove was present, something that had already been at work before she arrived. He did not speak much in the mornings, and neither did she. And this turned out to be one of the first things they had in common without knowing it. She spent the days at the table with the ledger. It was slow work, the kind that required attention to carry forward rather than speed, and she gave it both. The books were not dishonest exactly, but they were imprecise in the way that books kept by someone who understood ranching but not accounting tended to be imprecise. Entries that should have been separated had been combined. Costs that recurred had been listed inconsistently, sometimes by vendor, sometimes by category, sometimes by nothing that she could identify as a system at all. She did not criticize this. She simply began the work of untangling it, line by line, carrying forward the correct figures into her own ledger, and noting the discrepancies in the margin in small, neat handwriting. On the 3rd day, she found the entry that had been bothering her since the first morning. It appeared once a month, regular as the moon, a small amount paid out to an address she did not recognize, listed only with the initials OP. It was not a large sum, but its regularity was precise in a way that the rest of the book was not, which meant someone had been careful about it specifically. She wrote it in her margin with a small circle around it and moved on. Callum worked outside through most of the daylight hours. She could track his movements by sound, the different rhythms of different tasks, the steady percussion of the axe when he split wood, the more irregular sounds of repair work on the fence or the barn, the occasional voice when he spoke to the horses, which she noticed he did more often than he probably realized. In the evenings he came in and washed at the basin in the corridor and sat at the table across from her, and they ate what she had prepared, which was better than what he had been making for himself, she suspected, though he never said so. He ate without comment, which she had decided to interpret as approval rather than indifference. They talked sometimes, not much, and not about anything that mattered yet, but the silence between them was becoming slightly less careful with each passing day, which was its own kind of progress. On the fourth morning, she looked out the window and saw him at the far edge of the yard, crouched beside his horse, lifting one of the animal's rear hooves and examining it with an expression she recognized even at distance as the expression of someone finding bad news they had been half expecting. The horse was a dark bay, well built, but showing the kind of wear that came from years of hard use. And when Callum put the hoof down and straightened and looked at the animal's leg the way he did, with his hands on his thighs and his head slightly lowered, she understood that the news was not good. She put on her coat and went outside. He looked up when she crossed the yard but did not say anything, which she had learned meant he was willing to let her approach. She stopped a few feet away and looked at the leg he had been examining. The pastern was swollen, not badly, but enough to be visible, and the horse was holding the leg with a slight favoring that would have been easy to miss if a person wasn't looking for it. "How long?" she said. "Few days, maybe a week." He looked at the leg rather than at her. "She favors it on cold mornings, but works out of it by midday. I was hoping it would settle on its own." Marin crouched beside the leg and put her hand on the pastern and felt the warmth there, the particular heat of inflammation that was deeper than the surface. She had grown up in a household that kept one aging horse and a father who refused to pay for a veterinarian when he could find someone willing to advise for free, which had taught her more practical animal medicine than most women her age knew. "It needs a poultice," she said, "and she needs to rest it for at least 4 days. Not complete rest, but no hard work." He looked at her then, not skeptically, but with the particular attention of someone revising an estimate. "You know horses. I know this much about them." She stood. "Do you have comfrey? Or plantain leaf if there's none, something to draw the heat?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There might be comfrey in the supply crate. The woman at the trading post last spring put it in with the order. I didn't know what to do with it. They found it together, a small bundle of dried herb tied with twine at the bottom of one of the supply crates, and Marin crushed it with the back of a spoon and mixed it with enough water to make a paste and packed it against the swollen joint and wrapped it with cloth. And she showed him how to change it twice a day and what to look for that would mean it was getting worse rather than better." He watched everything she did with the same thorough attention he gave most things, saying nothing, missing nothing. When it was done, he stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not gratitude exactly, though it might have been that. Something closer to recalibration. He did not say anything about it, but that afternoon, when she came back to the table after stepping outside for air, she found a second chair had been moved from against the wall to her side of the table, angled slightly as if someone had thought she might want somewhere to rest her notes that wasn't the same surface she was writing on. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. She put her papers on the new chair and went back to work. The entry for OP stayed circled in her margin for 2 more days before she did anything about it. She had learned enough about the rhythm of evenings to know that there was a window of time after the meal was cleared, and before he went to check the barn, a window of maybe a quarter of an hour, when he was most likely to sit without a particular task and therefore most likely to be open to something being said. She waited for that window on the 6th evening, and when it came, she took her ledger to the table and opened it to the page with the circled entry and set it in front of him without saying anything. He looked at it. She watched his face, and what she saw there was not irritation or evasion, but something rawer than either of those things. A stillness that looked like it required effort. OP, she said, it goes back further than the pages I have access to. It's consistent, same amount, same interval. He did not answer immediately. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and she could hear it moving through the pines on the north side of the property. Owen Price, he said at last. My brother. She waited. He left 3 years ago. We had a disagreement. He said the word the way people said words that were much too small for what they meant. I don't know where he is now. I send the money to an address I had for him. I don't know if he's still there. I don't know if he's still anywhere. The last 3 words came out flatter than the rest, the flatness of a man who had said something so many times in his own head that it had worn smooth. She looked at the circled entry and then at him. You keep sending it anyway. Yes. She closed the ledger. She did not tell him what she thought about this, which was that it was one of the lonelier things she had encountered. The faithfulness of a gesture made without any certainty of being received. She simply closed the ledger and set it aside, and the evening continued as evenings did, and she filed the name Owen Price in the same part of her mind where she kept the sound of the late-night rider and the circled numbers and the final notice hidden in the drawer beneath her notes. On the 8th day, a wagon came from the trading settlement 3 hours east. She heard it before she saw it, and she went to the window the way she had started doing whenever a sound came from the road, a habit she had not had before, and did not examine too closely. The wagon was a supply run, 2 men she didn't recognize, and a load of goods that Callum had apparently ordered some weeks ago. She stayed inside and watched through the window as they unloaded, and she noticed that one of the men spoke to Callum at some length near the barn door, standing close and speaking in a tone too low for her to hear, and that the expression on Callum's face during this conversation was careful in a way his expressions were usually not. After the wagon left, Callum came inside and hung his coat and did not go to the table where her ledger was laid out, but instead went to the window on the east wall and stood with his back to her and looked out at the road for long enough that she noticed. She did not ask, but she watched. That evening he said, without preamble, while she was writing up the afternoon's figures, "That man who came with the supply wagon, he worked here 3 seasons back. Good hand. Left for work closer to the settlement." She looked up. "He heard some things at the trading post," Callum said. "About Drum. About who he's been talking to." She set her pen down. "What kind of things?" "The kind that suggest he isn't just interested in buying land." He turned from the window finally and looked at her. "He's been talking to the lending offices, not just mine. 3 or 4 operations in this valley, all the ones with outstanding debt, asking about terms, asking about timelines. Marin thought about the final notice in the drawer beneath her notes. 6 weeks, it had said. She had not mentioned it yet. She was still deciding when and how, and the man's manner at the time of finding it had made her cautious about the order in which information should be introduced. But now she looked at Callum across the table and understood that the order no longer mattered as much as the content. "I need to show you something," she said. She got the notice from the drawer. She brought it to the table and unfolded it and set it flat in front of him and stepped back. He looked at it the way he had looked at the circled entry in the ledger, with that careful stillness, and she watched his face as he read it and understood what it was. "Where did you find this?" he said. His voice was level. "In the ledger. It had been folded into the middle pages." She paused. "I think it was put there intentionally, filed where it wouldn't be found easily." He looked at the notice for another long moment. Then he looked at her, and she could see him working through something, deciding how much of whatever he was thinking to say out loud. "The debt is real," he said finally. "I've been making payments. They've been smaller than they should be. I know. I found the payment records." She sat down across from him. "The amount remaining is workable if the ranch is producing what the stock numbers suggest it should be. But the stock numbers don't match the revenue figures. There's a gap I haven't been able to account for." He was quiet. "Is there something I don't have access to?" she asked carefully. "Another book or records kept somewhere else?" He stood up and went to the supply shelf and moved 2 tins aside and reached to the back and brought out a second ledger, smaller than the first, its cover dark with handling. He set it on the table in front of her and sat back down and looked at the wall behind her head. She opened it. The entries inside were sparse, written in a different hand than the main ledger, and they recorded a series of payments going back almost 2 years. Payments out, regular, substantial, to a name she did not recognize. Not initials this time, but a full name. Drum Consolidated Holdings. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Callum. "He's been receiving payments from you," she said. "Not the lending office, Drum. The lending office sold the debt," Callum said. He was still looking at the wall. "About 1.5 years ago. I found out after. They didn't notify me. 1 month I sent the payment to the office and got a letter back telling me the account had been transferred." A breath. "To Drum." The room was quiet for long enough that the stove had time to settle once, and the wind to find a new pitch against the north wall. Marin looked at the ledger and thought about Silas Drum standing outside with his hat in his hand and his pleasant face and his eyes moving to the table. She thought about the final notice and the 6-week deadline and the gap in the revenue figures and the supply man speaking quietly in the barn doorway. She thought about the way all of these things arranged themselves when she put them next to each other, the pattern they made, which was not a complicated pattern once you saw it, but which required seeing it from the right angle. "He's not trying to buy the ranch," she said. Callum looked at her. "He already owns the debt," she said. "He's been waiting for the deadline. If the payment isn't made in full by the end of the notice period, the holding passes to him by default. He doesn't need to negotiate. He just needs to wait." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from any of the silences they had shared over the past week. This one had weight to it, the weight of a thing understood. Callum stood up from the table and walked to the door and stood with his hand on the frame and looked out at the dark. He stood there for a long time, and she let him. She had been the bearer of bad news often enough in her father's house to know that the person receiving it needed time to let it become real before anything useful could be said about what to do with it. When he turned back, his face had settled into something that was not resignation, but that was close to it. The look of a man making peace with a new piece of terrain before he decided how to cross it. "What's the gap?" he said. "The revenue gap. What's the number?" She told him. He did not flinch, which she respected. "Can it be closed in 6 weeks?" She thought about it honestly rather than quickly. Not by production alone. The ranch would need to be running at capacity, and it isn't. But, she paused. If the debt amount can be verified against what's actually been paid versus what's been recorded, there may be a discrepancy there too. If Drum acquired the debt and has been managing the records himself, there's no guarantee the balance he's claiming is accurate. Callum looked at her. "I'd need to see his figures," she said, "which we don't have access to. But the payments you've made are recorded here." She touched the small ledger. If the total doesn't match what he claims is outstanding, that's not a matter of inability to pay. That's a matter of record. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "You can do that. Verify it." "Yes." He nodded, and again there was that quality of recalibration, something in his estimate of her shifting without announcement. He went to the stove and added wood, and the fire kicked up and threw more light across the table. And in that light, she looked at the two ledgers side by side and thought about the 6 weeks remaining and the gap in the numbers and Silas Drum's eyes moving to the table on the first day. She was still thinking about it when 3 days later, Silas Drum came back. He came in the late morning, alone this time, driving the same black wagon at the same practiced pace, and he knocked at the door himself rather than waiting in the yard. Callum was out at the far pasture and would not hear the wagon from that distance. And Marin was at the table when the knock came, and she stood and straightened and went to the door and opened it. Drum was exactly as she remembered him. Pleasant, well presented, a smile that had the quality of something practiced so long it had become automatic. He held his hat and looked at her with an expression of such practiced warmth that she understood immediately he was not here on a social call and had not been the first time either. "Mrs. Price," he said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Mr. Drum." She did not step back to invite him in. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame, which was Callum's posture, she realized, the one he had used on this same doorstep. "What can I do for you?" He tilted his head slightly, the way a man did when he was deciding how direct to be. "I heard you've been going through the ranch accounts. I wanted to make sure you had what you needed. Sometimes when a property changes hands in terms of management, there are records that don't make their way into the local books. I'd hate for there to be any confusion." She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was behind her and in his face, and she was glad of it. "That's very thoughtful," she said. "The accounts are in good order. I don't think there's any confusion." "Glad to hear it." The smile did not waver. "And if there are any questions about the lending arrangements, I'm happy to sit down and go through the figures. Transparency is important in these matters. I've always believed that." She kept her expression entirely pleasant. "I appreciate that, Mr. Drum. If we have questions, we'll know where to find you." He looked at her for one moment longer than the conversation required. Then he put his hat back on and nodded once and went back to his wagon, and she stood in the doorway until the wagon had turned and gone back toward the road. And then she went inside and closed the door and stood with her back against it and let herself breathe. She went directly to the table, She picked up the small ledger with Drum's name in it, and she carried it to her room and put it in the drawer with the notice and her own ledger and turned the key, and she stood in the small room with the north-facing window and looked out at the pines for a moment. Then she went back to the main room and sat down at the table and began to work through the payment figures again, this time looking not for the gap in revenue, but for something more specific. The difference between what had been paid and what a man who controlled both the debt and the record of it might claim had been paid, if he believed no one was looking closely enough to know the difference. She was still working when Callum came in from the pasture an hour later and stopped when he saw her face. "Drum was here," she said, without looking up from the figures. He was still for a moment. "What did he want?" "He wanted to make sure I had what I needed." She looked up then. "He wanted to see what I knew." Callum hung his coat slowly. He came to the table and looked at what she was working through, and she explained it to him, the logic of it, the specific thing she was looking for in the figures, and he listened the way he listened when she explained anything, without interrupting, without looking away. When she finished, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "Can you find it?" he said. "If it's there." She looked at the numbers in front of her. "Yes," she said. "If it's there, I can find it." He nodded. He did not say thank you. He did not say anything else. He simply reached across the table and moved the lamp slightly closer to her side, where the light would fall better on the page. And then he sat back and folded his hands and waited in the quiet and particular way he had of waiting, while she worked. The cold came in harder the following week, the kind of cold that arrived not all at once but in increments, each morning a little sharper than the one before, until the water in the basin had a thin skin of ice on it when Marin woke, and the grass in the yard was stiff and white until mid-morning when the sun finally reached it. The sky stayed clear and very blue, and the light on the snow along the ridgeline was almost painful to look at directly. It was beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when they were also dangerous, and she had begun to understand that this was simply the nature of this place, that beauty and danger here were not opposites, but aspects of the same thing. Callum had been watching the weather the way she had seen sailors described in books, reading it constantly without appearing to, checking the sky at the door each morning before he put his coat on, noting the direction of the wind by some method she could not identify, making small adjustments to his plans for the day that she only understood in retrospect. When she mentioned this, he looked at her with mild surprise, as though it had not occurred to him that this was something he was doing, rather than something the weather simply required. "You can't work out here and not read it," he said. "First winter I was here, I didn't pay attention. Lost 2 weeks of work because I didn't see a storm coming that any of the old hands would have spotted in the clouds 3 days out." "Who taught you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Owen," he said. He had a feel for it. She had noticed that he said his brother's name more easily than he had at the beginning, which she took as a sign of something, though she was careful not to assign it too much meaning. She simply noted it the way she noted everything, filed it in the part of her mind that was building a picture of this man from the outside in, the way she always understood things, by accumulation rather than revelation. He had offered to teach her to ride properly in the second week, not as a kindness, but as a practical matter. She needed to check the eastern boundary of the property to understand the land the ledger was describing, and the eastern boundary was too far to walk in the time available before dark. She accepted in the same spirit it was offered, practically and without ceremony. The horse he gave her was not the dark bay, whose leg was healing well and who was still resting. but a smaller roan mare with a calm temperament and a tolerance for inexperience that suggested she had been used for this purpose before. The first morning was not graceful. She had ridden before, occasionally, badly, and her body remembered just enough to make her overconfident in ways that the mare quietly corrected. Callum rode beside her at a pace that required no effort from him and said very little, which she appreciated more than instruction would have been. By the second morning, she was better. By the fourth, she was able to keep her attention on the land rather than on the act of riding, which was the point. It was on the fourth morning, moving along the eastern fence line with the pines on their left and the open pasture on their right, and the cold coming off the snow in the shadow of the trees, that she told him about her father. She had not planned to. She had been thinking about the fence line and whether the posts on the eastern corner were as deteriorated as they looked from a distance. And then she had been thinking about the ledger figures and the gap she was still working through. And then, without quite knowing how she had arrived there, she was thinking about the desk in her father's study and the contract in the drawer beneath the invoice and the bottle of ink, and she heard herself speak. "He wasn't a cruel man," she said. "I want to be accurate about that. He was simply one of those people for whom other people don't quite become fully real. They exist in relation to what he needed from them. He wasn't aware of it. I don't think it would have helped if he had been." Callum did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the fence line ahead of them, but she felt his attention shift in the particular way it shifted when something she said was being given its full weight. "The contract was not malicious," she continued. "It was practical, from his point of view. He had a debt, and he had a daughter, and he found a way to address both. I think he believed he was being resourceful. I think he may even have believed he was providing for me." She paused. "He was wrong, but I have stopped being angry about it." Anger at him felt like a door that only opened in one direction and led nowhere I wanted to go. They rode in silence for a moment. The roan's breath made small clouds in the cold air. "What did he owe?" Callum said, not nosily, simply asking what she had offered to tell. "More than he earned in several years combined. He was a man who believed the next arrangement would be the one that worked. He made investments that didn't pay and borrowed to cover the losses, and made further investments to cover the borrowing. By the time I understood what the accounts actually looked like, there was very little left to work with. And you kept his books for 3 years, yes." He was quiet. The fence line curved slightly to the south, and they followed it. And in the distance, she could see where 2 posts had leaned together in a way that would need attention before the winter deepened. "You saw it coming," he said. "It was not a question. I saw the numbers. Seeing the numbers and being able to stop what they represent are different things when the decisions aren't yours to make." She kept her voice level, not because she didn't feel anything about it, but because the feeling was old enough now to have become simply part of the landscape of herself, something she lived alongside rather than something that stopped her. "I made what preparations I could. I put aside enough to cover the immediate creditors. The rest was beyond what I could manage without authority I didn't have." The leaning posts came closer. Callum slowed his horse, and she slowed hers, and they stopped, and he looked at the posts, and she looked at the posts, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Owen used to say our father was the same way," Callum said at last. He was still looking at the posts. "Not about money, about people. He'd decide what a person was for, and that was all they were. Took me a long time to see that he was right." A pause. "Took me losing Owen to see it clearly." She looked at his profile, the set of the jaw, the line of the brow, The way he held the reins with the particular looseness of someone who had done it so long it required no thought. She understood that he had just said something that cost him something, and she did not rush past it. "What happened?" she said carefully. "With Owen, if you want to say." He was quiet long enough that she thought he had decided not to. Then he said, "There was a dispute about 3 years back. A large operation, the kind that moves a lot of cattle and a lot of money, had been pushing into the valley, buying out the smaller operations or squeezing them until they sold. Some of the smaller ranchers tried to organize against it, block the land transfers legally, hold their ground." He paused. "They asked me to join them. I said no." She waited. "I had my own concerns. I thought the large operation would win regardless, and I didn't want to be on the losing side. I thought the smaller ranchers were being sentimental about land, and I wasn't willing to risk what I'd built for sentiment." His voice was even, but the evenness was deliberate. Owen thought differently. He stood with the smaller ranchers. He was vocal about it. When the dispute resolved in the way I'd predicted, the large operation made it clear that certain people were not welcome to continue operating in the valley. Owen was one of them. "And you couldn't stop it," she said, "or you didn't try." "I didn't try." He said it without flinching, which told her he had long since stopped letting himself flinch at it. "I told myself it wasn't my fight. I told myself Owen had made his choices, and I'd made mine, and that was the nature of disagreements between adults. I told myself a great many things that sounded reasonable and were mostly cowardice." The horses stood quietly. The wind moved through the pines on their left with a sound like distant water. "He wrote to me once," Callum said. "After he left. I didn't write back. I told myself I was giving him time to settle. Then enough time had passed that I didn't know how to begin." He looked at the fence posts. "The payments are the only honest thing I've done about it." She thought about the initials in the ledger, the small, careful amount, the regularity of it. She thought about faithfulness expressed in the only direction still available. She looked at his face, and she did not say what she felt, which was something too large and too complicated to be useful in this cold air on this fence line. She simply sat on her horse beside him and let the silence be what it was. After a moment, he dismounted and walked to the leaning posts and examined them without asking her to wait, which meant he understood she would. She sat on the roan and watched him work the base of the nearest post with his hands, testing how far gone it was, and she thought about what he had said and about what she had said and about the particular quality of this conversation, which had been unlike any other they had had, which had been unlike most conversations she had had with anyone. They rode back in the late morning with the cold behind them and the pale sun in their faces. She found the letter that evening. She had gone back to the old ledger after dinner, the main one, working through the back section of pages she had not yet fully cross-referenced. The portion she had set aside earlier in the week because the entries there were older and less immediately relevant to the debt question. It was in that back section, between 2 pages of entries from several seasons back, folded small and flat in a way that had been deliberate rather than accidental. The paper was heavier than the ledger pages. The fold lines softened with time, and when she opened it, the handwriting inside was different from any entry she had seen in the book. Smaller, more angular, set down quickly. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still at the table for a long moment before she picked it up and went to the door and called Callum's name into the dark. He was at the barn. She heard him before she saw him. the sound of his boots on the frozen ground, and when he came into the light from the doorway, his face shifted when he saw her expression. She held the letter out to him. He took it and looked at the handwriting, and she watched his face in the lamplight, and what happened there was not what she expected. He did not go pale or rigid. He went very still, the way a man went still when something he had stopped allowing himself to hope for suddenly became possible again, and that stillness was more than any other reaction would have been. He read it standing in the doorway with the cold at his back, and when he finished he read it again, and then he lowered it and looked at something past her shoulder for a moment. "He's been here," he said. "Close. This was written from somewhere in this valley." She nodded. "The paper is not old. It was placed in the ledger recently, within the past few weeks from the look of it. Someone who knew the ranch well enough to know you would eventually work through those back pages, even if not soon." He looked at her. "Owen knows you well enough to know that," she said. "Well enough to know you'd go back to the ledger eventually, even if not right away." He read the letter a third time. She did not need to read it again to know what it said. She had it in her memory now, the way she held most things she had read carefully. Owen had been in the valley for months. He had come back because of Drum, because of what he had learned in the time since leaving about what Drum was doing and how he was doing it. Owen had worked briefly within Drum's operation before he understood what it was, and what he had seen there had given him material that mattered. He was watching and waiting. He was collecting what he needed. He had not come to Callum directly because he did not know what the years had done to the distance between them, and he was not ready to find out the hard way. But the note ended with something that had been making Marin's thoughts move quickly since she first read it. Owen wrote that the land acquisition scheme was larger than any single ranch. Drum was not collecting properties. He was collecting the water rights attached to them. Every parcel that fed into the valley's main watershed, every piece of land that held a spring or sat above an aquifer. The ranch, Callum's ranch, sat directly above the deepest water source in the valley. It was not the last piece Drum wanted. It was the piece he needed most. Callum lowered the letter. He looked at Marin across the table, and his face had the expression of a man who has just been handed a map that explains terrain he has been struggling through blind. "He's close," she said. "The letter is recent. He was watching this property when he placed it." Callum looked at the letter once more. She could see him working through what it meant, not just about Drum, but about Owen, about the fact of him, about the fact of his presence somewhere in the dark outside the circle of lamplight that fell through the cabin window. She did not push. She let him work through it in the silence that he needed, and she went back to the table and sat and looked at her ledger and thought about the water rights and the land parcels and how they would look laid out against each other, the shape they would make if she mapped the purchases Drum had made against the watershed boundaries she could reconstruct from the land descriptions in the ledger entries. After a long moment, Callum pulled out his chair and sat across from her. He set the letter on the table between them, face up, as though he wanted it visible. He put his hands flat on either side of it and looked at her. "The note says he's close," he said. "That he's been watching the property." "Yes. Then he's seen Drum come here. He knows what Drum is doing with the debt." "Almost certainly." He looked at the letter. "He came back because of Drum, not because of me." She looked at him carefully. This was the part that had been sitting in her chest since she first read the letter, the part she had not known how to navigate. She chose honesty over comfort because she suspected he would respect it more. "The letter doesn't say why he came back," she said. It says he came back. The reason it gives is Drum. But Owen chose to put the letter somewhere you would find it. He didn't have to do that. Callum was quiet. A man who came back only for Drum would have had no reason to tell you he was here, she said. He could have done what he needed to do without you ever knowing. Something shifted in Callum's face, small and gone almost before it registered. But she had been watching him long enough now to catch small things. He stood and went to the stove and added wood and stood with his back to her for a moment. And she looked at the letter on the table and then at the window where the night was complete and still beyond the glass. And she thought about a man somewhere out in that dark who had been watching the light in this window and deciding whether to come closer. When Callum turned back, his face was set in the way she had come to recognize as his version of having made a decision. I need to find him, he said, not to bring him in, not to force anything, just to let him know. He stopped. That you're here, she said, that I'm not the same as I was. He said it with difficulty, not because he was uncertain about it, but because saying it required acknowledging how far the distance had been to get there. She nodded. She did not offer easy reassurance. She simply acknowledged it, which was what the moment required. Then she picked up her pen and turned her ledger to a fresh page and said, "Sit down. I want to show you what I think Drum's full acquisition looks like when you map the water rights against the parcels. Because if Owen has the evidence he says he has, and I have the numbers I have, we need to understand the complete picture before we decide what to do with either." He sat. He pulled the lamp closer without being asked. She spread her notes across the table and began to draw it out for him, the shape of what Drum had been building in the years before either of them had been looking closely enough to see it. And as she talked and he listened and the fire kept the worst of the cold outside where it belonged, something settled between them that was different from the careful professional arrangement of the past weeks. It was not yet named. It did not need to be. It was simply there, the way the lamp was there, throwing light on everything within its reach and making the dark outside seem further away than it had been before. The trouble came the way serious trouble usually came, not as a single blow, but as a series of smaller ones, each arriving before the bruise from the last had finished forming. It began with the supply line. 3 days after they found Owen's letter, the merchant who had been providing Callum's feed grain sent word that he could no longer honor the existing arrangement. The message came through a rider who stopped only long enough to pass the folded note to Callum at the gate, and who was already back on the road before Callum had finished reading it. The note was brief and offered no explanation beyond a vague reference to changed circumstances and the hope that alternative arrangements could be found. There was an apology at the end that read like something written under instruction rather than regret. Callum brought the note inside and set it on the table, and Marin read it once and understood immediately what it was and what it was not. "Changed circumstances," she said. "He's been supplying this ranch for 6 years. Callum's voice was level, but the level was deliberate. "His circumstances haven't changed." She set the note down. "Drum has to be." He pulled out his chair and sat, not because he was calm, but because standing would not help anything. "The merchant owes Drum for property on the south side of the settlement. I knew that. I didn't think it would reach this far." She thought about the map she had drawn in her notes, the parcels and the water rights and the shape of what Drum had been building. She thought about leverage, about how it worked, about how a man who held enough debt in a community did not need to threaten directly. He simply made it clear, in ways that preserved everyone's dignity while leaving no actual choice, that certain behaviors would be remembered when the time came to call notes due. "He knows we found something," she said, "or he suspects it. This is pressure. He's trying to create enough difficulty that the deadline becomes irrelevant because the ranch is already failing." Callum looked at the table. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "The hay stores," she said. "What do we have? Enough for 6 weeks if I'm careful. Maybe 8 if the weather stays cold enough that the pasture grass holds any nutrition at all." He paused. "Not enough for the full winter." She opened her ledger and turned to the page where she had been tracking the operating figures. She looked at the numbers for a moment, and then she looked at him. "There's a supply operation 2 valleys west. The pricing will be higher because of the distance, but if we can arrange transport through the Hadley Crossing, the cost per unit is still within what the current accounts can support if I reallocate from the repair budget." He looked at her. "You know the Hadley Crossing. I know it from the land descriptions in the original purchase documents for this property. The crossing is recorded as an easement right. You have legal access." She paused. "Drum may not know that, or he may be counting on you not knowing it." Something shifted in his expression, not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. He nodded. "I'll send a message today." She was already writing the figures. "I'll draft the terms, so there's nothing to renegotiate later." They moved quickly and carefully, and by the following morning the alternative arrangement was in motion, and it should have felt like a problem solved. It did not feel like a problem solved. It felt like one move in a longer sequence, which was what it was. The second blow came 4 days later. She heard it first from the well, where she had gone in the early morning to draw water before the temperature dropped enough to make the rope handle painful to hold. 2 of the ranch hands who worked the outer pasture were talking near the barn, not quietly enough, about a conversation one of them had overheard in the settlement the previous afternoon. A man from the lending side of Drum's operation had been asking questions about the ranch, not about the debt, which was known, about the ownership documents, about the marriage contract specifically, about whether a contract of that nature, signed under the particular circumstances of this one, conveyed property rights to the incoming party or merely domestic ones. She stood at the well with the rope in her hands and let this settle into her understanding. She drew the water and carried it back to the cabin and set it by the stove and sat down at the table with her ledger open to the page where she had transcribed the relevant sections of the marriage contract from memory. She had done this in the first week, quietly and without mentioning it, because the habit of understanding the precise terms of any document she was operating under was too deeply ingrained to override even when the document in question was her own marriage. She found the section she was looking for. It was in the 3rd page, in language that had seemed at the time like standard protective language for the incoming party, but which she now read differently, with Drum's question behind it. The section established that property held by either party at the time of the contract's execution could not be encumbered by the debts of the other. Standard language. Protective language, as she had read it. But there was a secondary clause, small, tucked into the latter portion of the section in language that was almost but not quite parallel to what preceded it. It established that assets contributed to the joint household in the course of the marriage, including financial management, accounts receivable, and any instruments of value created or developed during the term of the contract, could be considered shared property for the purposes of settling outstanding obligations. She read it twice. Then she sat with it and felt the cold clarity of understanding something she wished she did not understand. Her work. The figures she had found. The discrepancy in the debt balance, the map of the water rights, the case she had been building in her ledger over the past weeks. If Drum's people were asking about the contract, they were asking about this clause. They were asking whether the work she had done, the instruments of value she had created in the course of this marriage, could be legally accessed as part of the ranch's assets in the event of a forced settlement. Whether they could compel her to hand over what she had found. She was still sitting with the ledger open when Callum came in from checking the horses. He read her face before she spoke, which she had begun to understand was something he did automatically, a skill developed over years of reading terrain and weather and the small signals that preceded larger events. "What?" he said. She showed him the clause. She explained what she had heard at the well. She watched his face as he worked through it, and she saw the moment he arrived at the same place she had, the same cold clarity. He set the ledger down. He looked at the window. He can't force you to hand over your work, not directly. She kept her voice steady. But if the contract language is interpreted to place my work product within the category of shared assets subject to debt settlement, a legal proceeding could compel disclosure as part of the settlement process. It wouldn't need to be coercive. It would simply be procedural. And everything you found would be in Drum's hands. Yes. He looked at his hands on the table. She looked at them too for a moment. The roughness of them, the particular stillness they had when he was thinking hard. "You should go," he said. She looked at his face. "If your work product becomes a target, being here makes you one too." His voice was even, and it cost him something to keep it that way. She could hear the cost of it underneath. The contract can be dissolved. If you're not party to the ranch's obligations, Drum has no claim on what you found. She was quiet for a long moment. "The debt isn't yours," he said. "The ranch isn't yours. You came here under terms that weren't fair to begin with, and I'm not going to let what my father's arrangements have become pull you into something you didn't sign for." She looked at him across the table. She thought about the wagon ride that had brought her here, the cold and the hard seat, and the way she had held the contract in her hands and told herself she was not afraid. She thought about the lock on the door with its bright brass. The chair moved to her side of the table, the lamp brought closer. She thought about a man standing quietly beside his brother's grave at the back of the property, tending it in the dark because it was the honest thing left to do. "I have been running for a long time," she said, "from my father's debts, and from what those debts made of my life, and from the feeling that no matter what I did or how well I did it, I would always be the person to whom things were done rather than the person doing them." She paused. "I am not leaving. Not—" He looked at her. "Not because of the contract," she said. "The contract is a piece of paper, and we both know what it was and what it wasn't. I'm staying because I started something here that I intend to finish. Because the work I've done matters, and I'm not willing to walk away from it and let Drum have the field." She held his gaze. "And because I don't want to go." The last sentence was quieter than the rest. He heard it. She knew he heard it because something in his face changed in the small, particular way it changed when something reached him that he had not prepared a defense against. He did not respond immediately. He looked at the table and then at the window and then back at her. And what he said was not what she expected and was exactly right. "All right," he said. Simply that. Not a concession and not a declaration. Just an acceptance of what was true. That evening, the third blow came, and it was the worst of them. Marin was at the table when she heard the horses, more than one, coming at a pace that was not casual. Callum heard it at the same moment from wherever he was in the back of the property, and she heard him moving toward the front before she reached the window. Through the glass, she saw two riders coming through the gate, and in the low evening light, it took her a moment to recognize the one riding slightly ahead. It was Len Marsh. He had worked the east pasture since before Marin arrived, a quiet man in his 50s who spoke rarely, but worked with the kind of thorough competence that needed no commentary. Callum had mentioned him once as someone who had been with the ranch longer than anyone else, which she had filed away as meaning Callum trusted him. The second rider she did not know. Callum met them in the yard. She watched through the window, not because she was hiding, but because the conversation was clearly not meant for the cabin yet, and she had learned to respect the geography of difficult conversations. Marsh said something. Callum listened. The second rider did not dismount. After a short exchange, the second rider turned and went back through the gate the way he had come, and Callum stood in the yard watching him go, and even from this distance and in this light, she could see the particular quality of his stillness. She put the kettle on the stove. When Callum came in, Marsh was not with him. He hung his coat without speaking, and she did not rush him. She poured water that was not quite boiling yet into 2 cups and set them on the table and sat down and waited. He sat. He looked at the cup for a moment. Marsh has been talking to Drum's people, he said, not recently, for the past 3 months. She was still. The writer was someone who thought I should know before the deadline. Thought Marsh owed me that much. He wrapped his hands around the cup without lifting it. Marsh has a son who borrowed money from one of Drum's affiliated creditors to buy equipment for a spread of his own 2 valleys over. The debt's been called in. Drum's people told Marsh that if he kept them informed about what was happening here, the debt would be managed favorably. She thought about Drum's first visit, the day after she arrived, the way his eyes had gone to the table. She thought about the supply merchant's note and the question about the contract clause, and she thought about how these things arranged themselves in sequence, how they formed a picture of a man who had not been reacting to her and Callum, but anticipating them, who had been several steps ahead because he had been receiving information about where they were. The figures I found, she said carefully. The discrepancy in the debt balance. The work I've been doing. She paused. How much of that has Drum known about? Callum looked at her. I don't know how specific it was. Marsh didn't have access to your ledger, but he would have known you were working through the accounts. He would have known you were finding things. She sat with this. She thought about the particular cold clarity she had felt that morning reading the contract clause, and she felt it again now, but differently. It was not defeat. It was recalibration. The same process she went through when figures she had assumed were correct turned out to require revision. You did not feel defeated by a wrong number. You corrected it and worked forward from the corrected position. Then he knows we know something, she said, but he doesn't know what exactly. And he doesn't know about Owen. Callum's eyes moved to her face. Owen placed the letter where you would find it, she said. Marsh didn't know about the letter because we found it before Marsh had any reason to look for it. Drum's information about this ranch has been coming through Marsh, which means Drum knows we're working against him. He doesn't know we have a witness who worked inside his operation. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Owen said he had evidence in the letter. He said he was collecting what he needed. Yes? But the letter was written before he knew we'd found it, before he knew how little time is left. He looked at the table. He may not know the deadline is as close as it is. She thought about a man somewhere in the dark outside this circle of light, watching and waiting and not yet knowing that the window he was waiting for had begun to close. "We need to reach him," she said, "before Drum moves again." Callum stood. He went to the door and stood with his hand on the frame and looked out at the dark, the same posture he had used the night he told her about Owen the first time, standing in his own doorway between the warm and the cold, caught between what was inside and what was outside that light. She watched him from the table, and she thought about what she had said that afternoon, that she did not want to go, and she thought it again now, quietly and with more certainty than she had said it with, because she had said it before the third blow fell, and she still felt it after, which told her it was not conditional. He turned from the door. The expression on his face was something she had not seen before, something that combined the set jaw she knew with something underneath it that was rawer and less certain, the look of a man who has spent years being adequate to whatever came at him and has arrived at something he is not sure he is adequate for. "I don't know where he is," he said. "I have the address I've been sending the payments to. I don't know if he's still there. I don't know if he's anywhere near it." She looked at him. "You've been sending a letter with every payment." "No, just the money." She stood up. She went to the shelf where she kept her correspondence paper, which she had brought in the satchel and had not yet had occasion to use for anything except her own notes. She set a sheet on the table and looked at Callum. "Tell me what you want to say," she said, "and I'll write it in a way that says it." He looked at the paper. He looked at her. She saw him working against the habit of a man who had taught himself that wanting things said and having them said were two different categories that did not often meet. Then he sat down across from her and put his hands flat on the table on either side of the paper, and he began to talk, quietly and without stopping, and she listened and wrote. And the letter that took shape between them was not long, but it was exact in the way that a thing was exact when it had been carried unsaid for long enough to be perfectly clear by the time it finally found words. When it was finished, he read it once and nodded, and she folded it and wrote the address from the ledger on the outside and sealed it. And they sat for a moment in the lamplight with the sealed letter between them on the table. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "the rider who comes with the east pasture reports. He goes back through the settlement. He can take it." "Yes." She looked at the letter, and then at the ledger, and then at the window where the dark was complete and still. She thought about Drum and the clause in the contract and the information that had been moving from this ranch to his operation for 3 months, while she and Callum worked in what they had believed was privacy. She thought about the shape of what was coming. "Before we send that letter," she said, "I need to show you something I found in the deed records this afternoon. Something about the water rights that I don't think Drum knows we know." She pulled her ledger toward her and opened it to the page where she had been working when the riders came. "Because if Owen can get to us before the deadline, what he has and what I have together will tell a complete story. But we need to know exactly what that story is before we decide how to tell it." Callum leaned forward. She moved the lamp between them and began to explain. And the fire held the cold outside where it belonged, and the night pressed against the windows without getting in. And on the table between them, the sealed letter waited for morning. The 3 days after the letter was sent were the quietest the ranch had been since Marin arrived, and also the longest. They worked as they always worked, she at the table and he outside, but the rhythm of it had changed in the way that rhythms changed when something was coming that could not be hurried. She found herself checking the east window more often than was useful. She noticed him finding reasons to walk to the gate and back that neither of them commented on. The figures in her ledger were as complete as she could make them without Owen's documents. There was nothing left to prepare that she had not already prepared. There was only the waiting, which was its own kind of work. And the fire kept burning, and the 2 cups of coffee appeared each morning in the particular way she had learned worked best with his stove, and the silence between them had stopped being empty some time ago, and was now full of the same thing both of them were carrying without saying. On the first evening of waiting, she sat at the table after the meal was cleared and looked at the lamp and thought about all the ledgers she had worked through in her life. Her father's books, year after year, column after column of numbers that told a story he refused to read. The correspondence she had taken in for merchants who needed clean handwriting and asked no questions. The ranch ledger she had opened on her second morning here and known immediately was concealing something. The way a surface that looks level reveals its tilt only when water is placed on it. She had spent her life reading numbers that other people couldn't or wouldn't read, and for most of that life, it had amounted to nothing beyond the reading itself. It had not saved her father. It had not saved herself from the contract in the drawer. But here, it might save something. That was different. She held that difference in her mind carefully. The way she held things, she was not yet ready to call by their true names. Callum came in from checking the horses and sat across from her without asking what she was thinking, and without filling the silence with words that weren't needed. That was something she had grown accustomed to. His particular economy with language, the way he seemed to understand that a room could be occupied by 2 people in good company without either of them having to perform the fact of it. She had not known many people like that. She had not known she was one herself until she arrived here and found another. On the second day, she asked him about the small grave behind the cabin. She had seen it from the north window and had not asked until now, sensing without being told that it was not her question to ask until he was ready for her to ask it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it had been a horse, the first one he had bought when he came to this land, before the ranch was anything more than a piece of ground and an intention. She had carried him through 3 winters and the worst of the early years, and when she went lame beyond recovery, he had buried her there rather than leaving her for the wolves, which was not a practical decision, and which he did not apologize for. She looked at him across the table, and she thought that this was the most she had ever understood about who he was from a single answer, and she did not say so. On the second evening, he said, out of the ordinary flow of things, while she was banking the stove for the night, that he was glad she had not gone when he told her she should. He said it the way he said most things that cost him something, quietly and without looking at her directly, as if the words were being addressed to the room rather than to anyone in it. She kept her hands on the stove and did not turn around right away. She let the words settle into the room at their own pace. Then she said that she was glad too, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the ledger or the deadline or any of the things that had seemed like the whole of her reasons at the time. There was a long quiet after that. Not uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that came from 2 people having said something real and not needing to build anything on top of it. On the 3rd night, she could not sleep. She lay in the small room with the north-facing window and listened to the ranch sounds and thought about Owen out there somewhere in the dark. and about the letter sealed and sent, and about what it meant that she was lying in this room at the end of this road she had not chosen, and feeling, despite everything, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had not felt that before. Not in her father's house. Not in the boarding house. Not anywhere she could name. She held the feeling carefully, the way she held things that were still becoming what they were going to be. Owen came on the third morning. He did not come the way Maren had imagined, though she realized afterward that she should not have been imagining anything at all. The shape of a man who had spent years staying invisible in a landscape that wanted to expose him would not announce itself with sound or motion. He simply appeared at the edge of the tree line as the sun was coming up over the ridge, standing still enough that she almost missed him entirely when she looked out the east window with her coffee in both hands. And then Callum was already moving toward the door because he had seen something she had not. Some particular quality of stillness at the tree line that he recognized before his mind had finished forming the thought of what it was. She stayed inside. She understood without being told that this was not the moment for her presence in the yard, that there were things that needed to happen first in the cold open air between the pines and the gate before the cabin could hold all three of them. There were years out there that needed to be crossed before anyone came inside. Through the east window she watched them. Owen stepped out of the shadow of the pines with a deliberateness that was not hesitation but something more considered. The movement of a man who had thought about this moment many times and was now walking through the real version of it and finding it different from every version he had rehearsed. Callum went to meet him, and they closed the distance between them and stopped and stood for a moment without touching. Two men looking at each other across years that had changed both of them in ways that neither could yet measure. Then Callum put his hand on Owen's shoulder, and Owen's head dropped briefly and came back up, and his eyes were wet in the early light, and Callum's jaw was tight with something he was not going to let become a sound. And that was all. And it was enough. And she looked away from the window and gave them the rest of it in private. She refilled the coffee pot and set it back on the stove, and stood in the center of the room she had come to know in the particular way you came to know a place you had worked in daily. By the way, the light moved through it at different hours, and the way the boards had their specific voices underfoot, and the way the stove needed tending differently in the mornings than in the evenings. She stood in this room and listened to the sound of boots on the frozen ground outside, coming closer, and felt something settle in her chest that she did not yet have a precise name for. Owen Price was younger than Callum by enough years to show it clearly, leaner in the way of someone who had been living lightly and moving often, with the same gray eyes and the same quality of watchfulness, though in Owen it sat differently, more mobile, more practiced at the quick read of a situation and the rapid adjustment to what it required. He came inside with Callum and stopped in the doorway and looked at Maren across the room with an expression that was measuring but carried no hostility in it. Only the careful assessment of a man who had learned to take nothing for granted and extended that habit to people as well as places. She looked back at him with the same directness, and Callum said her name and Owen's name in the same breath, and that was the whole of the introduction, which suited all three of them better than ceremony would have. She poured coffee. Owen sat at the table and drank it with the focused attention of someone who had not had any in several days, which turned out to be accurate. He curled both hands around the tin cup and let the warmth work into his fingers, and for a moment he simply sat and breathed. And she understood that she was watching a man allow himself to stop moving for the first time in a long while, and she did not interrupt it. He had been in the valley for the better part of 4 months. He had kept himself between a small abandoned structure he had found in the upper tree line, a trapper's shelter from an earlier era, weathered down to its bones but solid enough to sleep in, far enough off any traveled route to stay invisible, and a rented room in the settlement under a name that was not his own. He had been inside Drum's operation for 6 weeks the previous winter, long enough to understand its structure completely. The way the land acquisitions fed into the water rights, and the way the water rights fed into a much larger arrangement with interests further east that wanted to control the valley's agricultural output at its source. He had understood early that he was looking at something larger than it appeared from any single angle. He had stayed until he had seen enough to be sure of the shape of it, and then he had left, taking with him what he needed and nothing that would be noticed missing before he was well clear. What he had taken were documents, not many, and not the kind whose importance was immediately legible, but the kind that became important when placed alongside the right context. Deed transfer records carrying dates that did not align with the dates of the legal filings. Correspondence between Drum and the Eastern interests, written carefully, but not carefully enough, that established intent in language that a patient reader could follow to its conclusion. And a small ledger, kept by a man within the operation who had since left the territory entirely, that recorded the actual water right values assigned to each parcel in the internal accounting against the values declared in the public transfer instruments. Marin asked to see everything. Owen looked at Callum, and Callum looked at Marin, and something moved between all three of them that required no articulation, a shared recognition that the question of who was party to this and on what terms had already been answered in the days before Owen arrived, that the answer was not in doubt, and that the answer included her fully. Owen opened the leather case he had carried in from the tree line and put the documents on the table. She worked through them for 2 hours. The brothers sat and talked during this time in the low, careful way of men relearning a language they had once been fluent in, and finding, with some relief, that more of it has survived than they feared. She listened while she read, not intrusively, but in the way she had always listened to background things, with the portion of her attention that could hold 2 streams at once without losing either. She heard Callum say things he had not said to her, the specifics of how the ranch had drawn in on itself in the years after Owen left, the way certain winters had come closer to the edge than he had let show to anyone. She heard him say once, without looking up from his hands, that there had been a period of months where he had not been entirely sure what he was holding on for, only that stopping felt worse than continuing, so he had continued. She heard Owen say that he had received every payment, every single one, that there had been a stretch of nearly a year when he had not opened the envelopes, but had kept them in a box he carried with him from place to place, and that eventually he had opened them and read what was not written in them, which was the same message repeated faithfully every month for years without variation, and that the weight of that faithfulness had been, in the end, the thing that turned him back toward a place he had told himself he was finished with. As she heard Callum say, quietly and without looking up, that he should have written something, that he had started letters and not finished them, that he had told himself Owen needed time, and had kept telling himself that, until time had stopped being a reasonable excuse and become something else. She heard Owen say that he should have come back sooner, that he had known where the ranch was, that coming back had always been a choice he was making or not making, and that not coming back had been the easier choice for longer than he was proud of. Neither of them said anything further about it. The account was settled between them in those few plain sentences, put down without drama and without the performance of forgiveness, which made it more real than any ceremony would have. By mid-morning, she had laid Owen's documents against her own figures and built the complete picture out of both. She felt the particular satisfaction that came not from good numbers, but from true ones, from a set of accounts finally brought into honest alignment so that what they showed was what actually existed and could therefore be used. She explained it to both of them, working through each step, making sure every piece of the logic was visible before moving to the next. The false valuations in the transfer documents created a measurable discrepancy between what Drum had actually paid for the water rights and what he had declared as their value in the debt instruments he had used to leverage further acquisitions across the valley. Owen's internal ledger showed the real values. The public transfer records showed the declared values. The gap between them, consistent across every parcel in the acquisition sequence, constituted a pattern of systematic misrepresentation in instruments that had been used to establish legal claims over property, including the debt Drum held against Callum's ranch, including the deadline he had been using as a weapon. If the debt instrument had been established through misrepresentation, its legal standing was not what Drum had been presenting it as. Owen sat with this for a long moment. "You can prove that from what's on this table?" "Yes," she said. "The documents you brought establish the misrepresentation in the transfer instruments. The payment records Callum has kept establish the discrepancy in the claimed outstanding balance. Together, they constitute two independent grounds on which the debt as presented cannot hold." Callum looked at the table, then he looked at her. "Who do we take it to?" She had been thinking about this since the previous night. There was a magistrate who traveled the valley circuit, a man whose independence from local arrangements was precisely what his role required, and what made him useful in situations where local arrangements were themselves the problem. She had found a reference to his schedule in the settlement's printed notices, a stack of which she had been reading through steadily since her second week at the ranch, a habit formed in her father's house that had outlasted everything else from that period of her life. The magistrate was due within the week. She explained what she would need to prepare, the order in which the evidence should be presented, the language calibrated to carry weight without overreaching, the distinction between claims the evidence supported directly and those that required inference and should be presented with appropriate qualification. She explained that she would present it herself, and she said this not as a question or a proposal, but as a statement of what would happen, because she had prepared it and she understood it, and she was the one best positioned to explain it clearly. Owen looked at Callum with a look that asked something. "She presents it," Callum said, flatly and finally. Owen looked at her with an expression she recognized from his brother's face, the particular look that came when something had caused a person to revise their estimate of a situation significantly. He gave the small, precise nod that she now knew was the highest form of acknowledgement these two men offered, and she accepted it in the spirit it was given. She spent the next 4 days at the table. She did not hurry, and she did not cut corners. She organized the documents in the sequence that built the clearest argument, wrote the summary in language that was precise without being opaque, identified the specific instruments at the core of each claim, and checked every figure 3 times, because 3 times was the threshold at which she moved from hopeful to certain. She made full copies of everything in her own hand, working by lamplight in the hours after the cabin went quiet, her pen moving steadily across the pages while the fire kept its counsel and the dark pressed against the windows without getting in. Callum appeared at intervals with coffee he had made without announcing he was making it. He did not ask how the work was progressing. He understood, she had come to believe, that asking how something was progressing was a way of inserting doubt into it, and he had no doubt to insert. Owen provided 2 additional documents on the 3rd evening, correspondence he had been uncertain about including because he had not been sure of its relevance. It was more than relevant. It established the connection to the Eastern interests in terms explicit enough to remove any need for inference about intent. She revised 2 sections of the summary, and the overall argument became stronger for the revision, and she was glad he had mentioned them rather than deciding on his own. On the morning the magistrate was expected, she dressed in what she had, which was clean and well kept and serious. And she took the documents in Owen's leather case, and Callum saddled the roan, and they rode to the settlement in the pale early cold, with the sky lightening ahead of them, and the frost on the grass along the road, catching the first sun in brief. Glittering lines before the warmth dissolved them. Owen came separately by the route he knew, under the name that was still the settlement's name for him. It was better to keep that arrangement until the magistrate had heard what he needed to hear. The magistrate's temporary office was in the back room of the settlement's most substantial building, a room with walls that had absorbed years of difficult conversations and the particular dense stillness of a space where things that mattered had been decided alongside things that turned out not to matter at all. He was a compact man with close gray hair and a face trained by long practice into something that gave away nothing before it was ready to give anything. He gestured for her to sit, and she sat, and she opened the leather case and set the first document on the table between them, and she began. She did not perform. She did not appeal to anything except what the evidence showed and how it showed it. She moved through the documents in the sequence she had established, building the foundation carefully before placing anything on top of it, pausing where something needed to be fully understood before the next piece could mean what it meant. The magistrate asked questions that were sharp and specific and aimed precisely at the weakest points in the argument, which told her he was doing his job and not merely listening. And she answered each one directly, and with the same precision she had used in preparation. And where she was uncertain, she said so, and explained the boundary of what the evidence could and could not support. When she produced Owen, he came in from the outer room and sat and gave his account in his own words, steady and unhurried, and answered the magistrate's questions with the particular credibility of someone who had been inside what he was describing and had left it voluntarily and at cost to himself. It took nearly 4 hours. When it was finished, the magistrate sat for a long time looking at the documents spread before him. The settlement went about its ordinary business on the other side of the walls, the sounds of it muffled and distant and belonging to a different order of things than what was happening in this room. Then he looked at Marin. "You organized this material," he said. "Yes." He looked back at the documents. He was quiet for another moment that she did not attempt to fill. "This is very thorough work," he said at last. Methodical, clear. He began to gather the pages with deliberate care. "I'll need to retain the originals for the formal review. You'll have a written receipt for each document before you leave this room." She told him she had made complete copies in her own hand. He looked at her over the documents with the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected, and found the confirmation satisfying. "Of course you have," he said, and it was as close to warmth as his formal manner permitted, and she accepted it. The debt instrument would be suspended pending review, effective immediately. The deadline ceased to function. Drum would be notified through the appropriate channel and would have the opportunity to respond with any counter evidence he believed he had. The magistrate did not speculate about outcomes or make promises about what the review would conclude. But when he said that the evidence before him was substantial, he held her eye for a deliberate moment, and she understood what he was communicating within the constraints of what he could properly say, and she nodded once and thanked him and gathered her copies and left. They rode home in the late afternoon with the low sun at their backs and their shadows thrown long and thin across the road before them. The cold had softened, the brutal edge of the past weeks replaced by something that still required a coat, but no longer made breathing feel like an imposition. The roan moved with the relaxed rhythm of a horse returning to a known place, and Marin let her find her own pace, and watched the light on the dry grass and the weathered fence posts and the far dark line of the pines along the ridge. Callum rode beside her, and they were quiet for a long time, and that quiet was the comfortable kind, the kind that had earned itself over weeks of mornings and shared meals and lamps moved closer and chairs positioned without explanation. "It isn't finished," she said eventually. "No. The review will take time. He'll respond and he'll use everything available to him. There may be months of uncertainty before anything is formally resolved." "I know." He looked at the road ahead. "But he can't use the deadline. That's gone." A pause. "He'll have to find another way to come at this, and whatever way he finds will be slower and more visible. That changes what we're dealing with." She thought about the word "we" and held it the way she had held the word months earlier, with the careful attention you gave to things that were still becoming what they were going to be. The gate came into view, and the smoke from their chimney was visible above the roofline, which meant Owen had come back by his other route and arrived before them and done something practical with the fire, and something in her chest loosened at the sight of it. The specific loosening of a person arriving at a place that has begun to mean something more than shelter. Owen had made a meal from the cold store and the dried provisions on the shelf, plain and sufficient, and they ate at the extended table without ceremony, the three of them, in the particular quiet of people who are genuinely tired and genuinely relieved, and have not yet decided what to do with either state. Owen ate with the concentrated attention of someone allowing himself, for the first time in a considerable while, to stop scanning the edges of the room. Callum ate without speaking, and without needing to. Marin ate and felt the accumulated tiredness of the past weeks move through her like a slow tide going out, leaving something cleaner behind. After the meal, Owen went to the back room, the small one that had been cleared in the days before his arrival in anticipation of something that had not been named but had been understood and prepared for nonetheless. He closed the door, and the cabin simplified down to the fire and the wind outside and two people at the table in the lamplight. Marin went to the drawer. She took out the marriage contract and carried it to the table and set it down. Callum looked at it and then at her, and she could see him waiting to understand what she intended, not braced against any particular outcome, but attending fully to whatever was coming. She looked at the document for a moment. She thought about the wagon and the 11 days of hard road and the way she had held this paper in her lap and counted the miles and told herself she was not afraid. She thought about the lock with its bright brass, and the chair moved to her side of the table, and the lamp shifted closer without a word of explanation. She thought about the fence posts in the cold morning light, and Owen's letter folded into the back pages of the old ledger, and 4 nights of lamplight and copied figures, and the magistrate's careful questions, and the long ride home, with the shadows stretching ahead of them like something being laid down. She thought about what she had said to Callum in this room, that she did not want to go. She thought about how she had felt that then, and how she felt it now, and how those two feelings were related but not the same, because the first had been honest but fragile, still contingent on what might happen next, and the second was neither of those things. She picked up the contract and walked to the stove and opened the door and held the paper over the heat and let it go. It caught at the corner first, the edge browning and curling inward, and then the flame took the whole of it quickly. The paper consumed in the particular swift and total way of things that have been ready to be finished for longer than anyone said so. She watched it until there was nothing left to watch, and then she closed the stove door and stood for a moment with the warmth against her hands. When she turned, Callum was watching her from the table. His face was open in a way she had seen only in pieces before, the careful reserve that was his habitual expression set entirely aside, and what was underneath it was not soft exactly, but it was undefended, which in him amounted to the same thing. She looked at him with the same openness, because there was no longer any reason to manage what showed, no contract defining terms, no arrangement setting limits, nothing between this moment and the next, except what both of them chose. She crossed back to the table and sat down across from him. She set her hands on the table, and he set his beside them, close enough that she could feel the warmth without contact, and they sat in the lamplight in a quiet that had long since graduated from careful into something that belonged to them specifically, built out of all the particular mornings and evenings and cold rides and shared figures and spoken truths that made up the past weeks. He said her name, not the way he said it in the course of ordinary things, when it was simply a word that meant her. The way he said it now was different. It was a sentence in itself. It held a question and an acknowledgement at the same time, and she heard both. She looked at him across the table and she said, "I know," which was not the answer to what he had not yet asked, and was also exactly the answer, and he understood it as such. And the thing between them that had been becoming itself for weeks settled quietly into what it was, without drama and without announcement, the way the most important things tended to settle when they had been building long enough. Outside the north window, the last thin amber line at the horizon held for a moment before the dark came fully down over the ridge. On the far side of that ridge, the first snow of the season had already begun to fall, though they would not know this until morning, when the door opened onto a world remade overnight. The fence posts capped and the pine branches holding their soft weights, and the yard between the cabin and the gate transformed into unmarked ground, the kind that had not been walked on yet and could go in any direction. For now there was only the fire and the lamp and the table between them, and the sound of Owen in the back room, the small sounds of a man setting down a weight he had carried for long enough. For now there was the warmth and the quiet, and Callum's hands beside hers on the table. And the road that had brought her here was a long way behind them, and what lay ahead had no map and no name, and no terms written down anywhere, which meant it was entirely and without condition theirs to make together, one morning at a time, beginning with this one. She turned her hand over on the table. He put his into it. The fire held its steady light, and outside the snow came down soft and patient and covered everything that had been hard with something clean, the way the best mornings did out here when you had stayed long enough to receive them, when you had earned the right to let them mean something, when you had finally stopped running and found, in the stopping, that you had arrived somewhere worth being. Later, in the deep of the night, when the cabin was entirely quiet and the snow had thickened outside until it muffled every sound the world made, She lay in the small room with a north-facing window and looked at the ceiling in the dark and thought about the shape of what had happened. Not the events themselves, which she could reconstruct in order without difficulty, but the shape underneath them, the thing that the events had been carrying without anyone announcing it. She had come here with a satchel and 3 items and a number she had done in her head on the wagon, a cold arithmetic of options and outcomes that had produced exactly one answer. She had come telling herself she was practical, that she was capable, that she was not afraid. Some of that had been true. Some of it had been the kind of story a person told themselves to get through the first hours of a thing they had no choice but to do. But something else had happened here that she had not calculated for. You could not calculate for it because it came from outside the set of figures you were working with. It came from a chair moved to her side of the table. It came from a lamp shifted closer. It came from a man who said, "You can go," when he meant the opposite of go, and who had spent 3 years sending money to an address that might no longer hold anyone, because stopping would have meant giving up on something he was not willing to give up on, and who had told her both of those things not by saying them, but by doing them, day after day, in ways she had learned to read because she had been paying attention. She had always been good at reading things that other people put down without meaning to. Numbers, mostly. The shape of an account that had been managed with the intent to obscure something. The way a column of figures could tell you what was actually happening behind the column of figures if you knew how to look. She had applied that same attention to this ranch and to this man, and what she had found was not what the contract had described, and not what she had expected, and not what she would have been able to tell you she was looking for. She had found someone who was also trying to get through a thing they had no choice but to do, and who was doing it, like her, with whatever they had, without apology and without a great deal of fuss. That was enough. More than enough. It was the thing she had not known she was looking for until she found it here, in this small room, with the new lock and the north-facing window, and the snow coming down soft on the other side of the glass. In the back room, Owen was quiet. He had settled in the way of someone who had not had anything settled in a long time and was relearning how to allow it. She had heard him stop moving much earlier in the evening, and she was glad for him in a way that was clean and simple, and did not require any more thought than the gladness itself. Outside the gate, the road that had brought her here ran back through the dark toward a life that was finished, toward a boarding house and a father's desk and a document with crumbling wax that had once seemed like the whole shape of what the future held. It did not seem like that anymore. It seemed like the first page of something rather than the last, which was, she thought, probably the best thing that could be said about any ending. She closed her eyes. The snow kept falling. The fire in the main room held its warmth through the walls and into the small room where she lay, and she let that warmth be what it was, and slept. A story of 2 strangers, 1 ranch, and the truth that a contract could never contain.